The CEO is allergic to women until the intern touches him. Before we dive into this compelling story, we invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. We hope you enjoy it. The Rosenwald Estate, nestled in the wooded outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, followed a strictly controlled routine, almost ritualistic. Staff moved through the hallways with careful, measured steps, avoiding direct eye contact with the residents and never crossing a doorway without knocking twice with respectful precision. Every gesture was monitored, every misstep recorded. At the center of that intricate structure was Connor Rosenwald, CEO of Rosenwald Enterprises, one of the largest energy and logistics conglomerates on the East Coast. Young, brilliant, and methodical, he was rarely seen without his tablet in hand and a focused expression on his face. What almost no one knew was the real reason behind the extreme discipline that shaped his life. Connor suffered from a rare psychosomatic disorder, triggered by childhood trauma, that caused his body to react violently to the slightest physical touch from a woman. Seizures, loss of consciousness, muscle spasms. Any of it could be set off by a simple accidental brush. Since adolescence, when the symptoms had worsened, his grandfather and legal guardian, Malcolm Rosenwald, implemented a confidential medical protocol inside the family residence. No woman was hired without undergoing a series of physical, psychological, and, more recently, genetic screenings. For the candidates, it was presented as a rigorous corporate selection process. But the true objective was to find someone whose profile might, in some way, diminish or prevent Connor's adverse reactions to female contact. That October Wednesday, Natalie Pierce, newly hired as an archive assistant, had already received 3 warnings for minor tardiness. To avoid another, she chose to cut through the garden on the side of the property, a route she knew was free of cameras and supervisors. The service door, used for flower deliveries and garden maintenance, was ajar. She slipped in quickly, unaware of the risk she was taking. As she turned the corner connecting the greenhouse to the administrative wing, she bumped into someone. The touch was brief, just along the forearm, but it was enough. Connor, approaching from the opposite direction, stopped for a second, his muscles tensed, and then his body collapsed as if disconnected from all control. He dropped to the side, unconscious. The noise of the fall drew one of the assistants, who immediately called Dr. Levinson. Natalie tried to explain what had happened, but no one listened. She was escorted to the exit by security and dismissed that very night for violating internal protocol. No formal report was filed. Just one line was added to the house records: direct exposure, negative response. Her genetic analysis had revealed no compatibility. The next morning, at exactly 6:42 a.m., Avery Bennett, an intern in Rosenwald Enterprises Communications Department, received an email directly from the presidency requesting her presence at the family residence for a temporary assignment. Surprised by the request, Avery replied to clarify that her duties were limited to the company's main offices and that she had no experience with residential routines. The response came minutes later. Your presence is required. Car arrives at 7 a.m. She knew that refusing a direct order from that level could jeopardize her contract. She dressed discreetly, tied her hair back, and went down to the building lobby, where a driver was already waiting with her name on a sign. Upon arrival, she was greeted by a tall, poised woman who introduced herself as the head housekeeper. 3 rules only, Miss Bennett. Stay 20 inches away from Mr. Rosenwald at all times. Do not look him in the eye unless requested, and under no circumstance should you touch him. Avery tried to make sense of the instructions, but received no further clarification. It's a 3-day contract. Just follow the guidelines. At 7:45, Connor appeared in the mansion's main hall. He wore a light blue suit with no tie and kept his eyes glued to his tablet as he walked the corridor with precise steps. When he saw her, he stopped. Without lifting his gaze from the screen, he asked, "You're new here?" She responded firmly, trying to sound professional. "Yes, sir." He nodded, then memorized the protocol. 20 inches, no unnecessary noise, and never enter my line of sight without warning. He walked away. Avery remained still, processing everything she had just heard. Throughout the day, she observed the patterns of the household. All employees knew where not to be at every given hour. The hallways Connor used remained empty. Elevators were programmed to avoid stops outside his schedule. He was the center of a carefully maintained system of isolation. On the second day, Avery was carrying a tray of documents and a hot cup of tea when she tripped on the edge of a rug while climbing the stairs to the library. To keep from falling, she grabbed the handrail, and in the process, her hand brushed against Connor's arm as he was walking up just behind her. The touch was quick. His eyes locked onto hers. The mug fell to the floor, spilling tea and shards across the steps. But he didn't fall. No spasms. No fainting. Just a fixed, startled stare. Connor stepped back half a pace and looked at her. No anger. No immediate command. Just a moment that seemed filled with silent thought. Then he turned and walked down the corridor without a word. Avery stood still, trying to understand what had just happened. Someone in that house had surely taken notice, and it was clear that something about her had triggered a different response. That evening, the Rosenwald country house maintained its usual restrained atmosphere. A letter was hand-delivered, precisely folded inside a white envelope embossed with the family crest. It contained a single sentence: 8 p.m., East Library. Malcolm Rosenwald. Avery had returned to her small apartment in the Stanford suburbs as soon as her workday ended, just as the agreement outlined. She was finishing heating up a frozen dinner when her phone buzzed. The message came from an institutional number: car en route. Dress conservatively. Do not be late. At 7:15 p.m., she descended the 2 flights of stairs from her building and found a black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street. The driver opened the rear door without saying a word. The ride took a little over 40 minutes. Upon arrival, a security guard escorted her directly to the library, bypassing the other rooms in the house. Malcolm Rosenwald sat in a wide, dark leather armchair, lit by the warm glow of a classic table lamp. In front of him, a hardbound folder rested on a wooden table. He didn't even look up to greet her. He simply motioned with his hand, closed the door, and sit. The silence that followed was long enough for Avery to become fully aware of her own thoughts. Malcolm seemed to weigh his words with precision. Finally, he spoke. Connor has been evaluated for years at clinics and research centers. No meaningful results. 4 years ago, we centralized the effort and began searching for compatible profiles within our own employees. Nothing worked as hoped until now. Malcolm opened the folder calmly and pulled out a laminated document. In the upper corner was Avery's photo and full name. Your screening showed the lowest reactivity index ever recorded, even under simulated stress. When you accidentally touched him yesterday, none of the known symptoms appeared. No loss of consciousness, no cardiac irregularities, no muscle rigidity. Avery kept her eyes steady. Malcolm continued. We repeated the tests using residual contact samples. The data is consistent. Dr. Mitchell confirmed the findings with parallel analysis. Connor was informed this afternoon, and he has agreed to begin the protocol. He extended a second envelope. Inside was an 18-page contract, confidentiality clauses, a supervised cohabitation agreement, a schedule of public appearances, rules for temporary residence, the proposal, a 12-month arrangement. At the end, no legal obligations, a contractual bonus of $600,000 tax-free. This is not a sentimental proposal. It's a functional alliance with clinical potential and strategic value. Connor is about to step into a highly visible national role. He needs to demonstrate stability, approachability, accessibility. And most importantly, he must live with someone without physical risk. You're the only variable that makes that possible. Avery flipped through the contract. Everything was clearly outlined. She would not be an employee, nor a companion. She would be a temporary institutional partner with authorized access to specific areas, a monitored routine, and full psychological oversight. And if I say no, she asked. Malcolm was blunt. You return to your normal life. There will be no pressure, but you will remain under observation, at least for a time. And we will search for someone else, even knowing that person may not exist. Avery stood up calmly. She thanked him for the meeting. Malcolm gave a slight nod. Give us your answer by tomorrow, 8 a.m. If you accept, we'll send the driver. And Avery, this isn't a relationship. It's an assignment. Treat it as such. She left the library. The driver was already waiting in the same spot. On the ride back home, she held the envelope in her lap. She knew this wasn't a typical offer, but it also wasn't something easily dismissed. At exactly 7:59 a.m., Avery handed the signed contract to the security guard waiting at the side gate of the estate. No words were exchanged. He simply verified her identity, took the envelope, and led her to the service entrance, where an assistant was already waiting with a tablet in hand and a neutral expression. Your authorized access is from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. Transportation will be provided. Meals, security, and medical supervision are included. Your access card will be activated by the end of the day. Without much ceremony, she was escorted into the mansion and assigned to a support room on the first floor, equipped with a desk, a reading chair, and a glass partition overlooking a small interior garden. No luxurious accommodations or guest suites. Just a functional space where she could wait for scheduled interactions. Connor did not appear that morning. A legal department staffer informed her that the first contact would take place at 2 p.m. in one of the soundproof studios in the North Wing, a controlled, monitored environment with sensory isolation. Meanwhile, Avery received a binder with detailed guidelines, a structured schedule, behavioral instructions, alert indicators, and a glossary of neutral expressions. The words affection, emotion, and intimacy did not appear even once. Instead, physical response, non-reactive stimulus, stabilization protocol. At 1:58 p.m., she was led to the studio. Connor was already there, seated with his back to the door, adjusting the volume on a digital panel. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark slacks. He didn't turn around when she entered. He simply said, "You can stay 2 meters back. No need to speak yet." She obeyed. He finished the adjustments and stood. From today on, we'll have daily observation sessions. 20 minutes. Same time, same place. After that, we'll perform joint tasks. Reports will be written individually and reviewed by the medical team. Any deviations must be pre-approved. Understood? She nodded. He continued. Verbal communication must be direct. Avoid metaphors, emotional references, or ambiguous body language. It helps with data collection. Then he gestured toward the chair across the room. Sit. I'll begin. Connor spoke like an analyst describing a clinical case. He went over the history of his symptoms, the most common triggers, and the containment techniques used to date. He talked about himself, as if referring to someone else. When he finished, he glanced briefly at her. Your turn. Avery responded objectively, detailing her professional routine, academic background, and any prior experiences that might be relevant. There was no room for charm, friendliness, or curiosity. Everything was functional, calculated, measured. In the days that followed, The sessions were carried out with precision. Connor was methodical, but not hostile. He corrected spacing with a single gesture. He cut off vague statements with a single word. But he never crossed the boundaries that had been set. At the end of each session, he typed notes into his tablet and left without saying goodbye. On Friday, at the end of the first week, Avery received an email with no identified sender. Attached was the first evaluation report. Among the positive points, strict adherence to protocol, absence of inappropriate stimuli, good response to nonverbal commands. Among the negatives, slight hesitation before sitting, tendency to ask unplanned questions, excessive hand movements. Final score, 7.4. Nothing more. No signature. That evening, back in her apartment in Stamford, Avery opened her notebook and wrote just one line. Nothing that moves me, but everything that intrigues me. On Monday morning, Avery received a corporate phone notification at 6:45 a.m. Dressing room prepared in the East Wing. Arrival by 8 a.m. Event confirmed. It would be her first public appearance alongside Connor, and the Rosenwald Enterprises image team had planned every detail. The dinner would take place at the Metropolitan Business Circle, a private Manhattan foundation where business leaders gathered to secure partnerships, raise funds, and shape influential narratives. Upon arrival, she was greeted by a stylist waiting with 3 dress options, all in neutral tones, matte fabrics, and modest cuts. The chosen one was a petroleum blue sheath dress, paired with a light gray trench coat and medium-heeled shoes. Her hair was tied in a low chignon. Makeup was minimal, nearly invisible. Nothing allowed for personal preference. Everything followed the strict directive of sober and approachable presence. At the end of the prep, she was handed a folder with standardized questions and answers in case she was approached by journalists or guests. At the top, a red highlighted instruction. Upon arrival, arms linked, moderate eye contact, close body proximity, no hesitation. At exactly 6 p.m., Avery waited in the main hall. Connor arrived 2 minutes later, dressed in a dark suit and a silver tie. He didn't comment on her appearance. He simply said, "The car is ready. It's a 46-minute ride. When we arrive, don't speak to the driver or receptionists. Follow my lead." She nodded. He extended his arm. The gesture was technical but firm. As they linked arms, she felt the tension in his body, like a structure on the brink of collapse. They walked to the SUV in synchronized steps. The Metropolitan Business Circle was housed in a classical facade building, framed by columns and towering windows. As they arrived, camera flashes erupted the moment the car door opened. Connor stepped out first, then offered his hand to Avery with precise timing. They walked through the main hall and were welcomed by board members. "My companion, Avery," he said, curt but functional. They took seats at the central table, where every move would be closely watched. For the first 40 minutes, they exchanged hardly a word. Avery followed the script she had received. She knew when to smile, when to respond firmly, when to avert her gaze. When asked how they met, she answered with trained ease. It was during an internal restructuring. An unplanned meeting, but effective. Connor said nothing, though the tension in his expression softened slightly. The official photo was taken at the end of dinner. Couples were called one by one. Connor and Avery stepped forward to the designated area. He didn't offer his arm this time, but as they stood before the camera, he slowly reached his hand toward hers. She understood the signal and gently intertwined their fingers. The lights flashed. Connor didn't flinch. He looked directly into the lens, shoulders steady. His hand remained in place, firm. On the way back, the car was silent until they were just minutes from the estate. Then Connor said, "Your response was more effective than the version sent by PR." She acknowledged with a nod. He added, The contact during the photo triggered no symptoms. I consider it stable. Then he turned his gaze back to the window. No emotion, no praise, but also no rejection. At the drop-off, she exited alone and was driven back to Stanford. In her apartment, she left her shoes by the door, hung up her coat carefully, and stood before the desk where she kept her notes. She thought about writing something about the night, but closed the notebook before even opening it. In the mirror, she looked at the hand that had held his, and for a brief moment, she felt that the experience was no longer just part of the protocol. On Monday morning, Avery was instructed to attend a session with Dr. Mitchell, the neurologist overseeing the clinical data for the protocol. The consultation took place in one of the mansion's rooms, outfitted with acoustic panels, blackout curtains, and a round table with 2 chairs. The atmosphere felt more like a laboratory than a medical office. Seated across from him, she responded to a series of standardized questions. Did you experience any physical discomfort during the sessions? Did you notice visible muscular tension in the subject? Did you experience any unexpected emotional impact during the interactions? She answered each question neutrally. At the end, the doctor simply commented, "No alarming pattern so far, but phase 2 will require adjustments. Exposure time will be extended." Later that day, Avery was summoned for another session in the North Wing studio. This time, Connor was already seated, waiting. When she entered, he gestured silently for her to sit beside him. The chair, previously placed nearly 2 meters away, was now just half a meter from his. We're testing close, static proximity. Reading session. You can choose the material. Duration, 30 minutes. Interrupt only if there's clinical discomfort. His tone was the same, analytical, leaving no room for interpretation. She chose an essay on urban architecture she had brought with her. They sat side by side, elbows nearly touching. For the first 15 minutes, he remained silent, eyes fixed on the text in front of him. There was no tension, no withdrawal. His body temperature remained stable, and so did his breathing rhythm. After a while, Connor spoke, without looking away from the page. "Your presence doesn't alter my vital signs." "That's rare." Avery didn't respond. She just turned the page carefully. At the end of the reading, he commented, "We'll repeat this format twice a week. You can bring materials of your choice, as long as they're not emotionally provocative." She nodded. On Wednesday, at the end of the session, Connor offered her a cup of tea. It was the first time they shared anything like that. They sat at a small side table. For a few minutes, they watched the garden through the window. Then he said, "When I was a child, my mother used to gauge my anxiety level by watching my fingers. When they stopped moving, she knew I was about to break." Avery looked at his hands. They were still, resting on his knees. "And now?" she asked evenly. He looked at her briefly. "Now, they're not moving, and I'm not falling apart." On Friday, after a long meeting with the PR team, Connor walked her to the main hall where she waited for her car. On the way, he simply said, "You adapt quickly." She replied plainly, "I've had practice." Before she got into the vehicle, he added, "Next week, we'll begin off-site exercises. Wear comfortable shoes." Avery nodded. She stepped into the SUV and closed the door calmly. On the ride back to Stanford, she opened her notebook and wrote. His hands were still, but there was no tension. Something's shifting, and I'm not the only one noticing. On Tuesday, the day began with a shift in routine. For the first time, Avery didn't receive printed instructions outlining the day's activities. Instead, it was Connor who approached her directly at 8:10 a.m., lightly tapping on the doorframe of the room where she usually waited each morning. When she opened the door, surprised to see him there, he simply said, "Let's have breakfast together," on the East Pavilion veranda. She nodded and asked for a minute. Within 5 minutes, she was ready. Stepping out, She found Connor waiting in the hallway, hands in his blazer pockets, standing upright, but without his usual stiffness. During the meal, they talked about the weather, then about the menu. Once the table was cleared, the conversation had already shifted to a recent article on therapeutic environments designed with sensory focus. Connor described some of the studies with restrained enthusiasm. Avery listened attentively and remarked that certain projects seemed more about control than care. He chuckled, a brief but genuine sound. That's a diagnosis, and an accurate one. In previous days, any interaction outside the script felt like a deviation. Now, each conversation followed its own course. Sometimes, one topic led to another. Other times, there were pauses, not uncomfortable, just natural. The clinical schedule continued, but constant reminders were no longer necessary. They knew where they needed to be and were learning how to share that space together. That afternoon, he invited her for a brisk walk in the side garden. No supervision, no visible cameras. During the walk, they passed an old stone fountain. Avery commented that the sound of water reminded her of childhood vacations at her grandparents' house. My grandmother used to say that the sound of water was the closest thing to a clean memory. Connor stopped, listened for a moment, and asked, without irony, "Does your memory need calming?" Avery thought for a second and replied, "I don't know, but my mind does." Later in the afternoon, they participated in a new evaluation session with Dr. Mitchell. This time, instead of separate reports, there was a real-time observed conversation. The doctor took notes as they exchanged observations about the day. "You two seem to have reached a point of mutual accommodation," the doctor noted. Connor simply nodded. Avery didn't respond immediately but asked, "Does accommodating mean adapting or erasing oneself?" Mitchell smiled but didn't answer. Later, Connor knocked on the reading room door. He brought 2 books. "You mentioned the author yesterday. I found this annotated edition, and this other one has a similar theme. You might be interested." She accepted the books with a sincere thank you. Upon opening the first, she saw a page marked with a piece of paper. It wasn't a dedication, but there was a subtle hint of intention. Chapter 4. It discusses care as discipline. She smiled. "Do you always read thematically?" Connor replied naturally, "Always. It helps me better categorize what's important." She laughed softly. "Must be nice to live that way. Everything in its place." He responded lightly, "Sometimes it's just the illusion of control." The next morning, the sky was blanketed with low-hanging clouds, and a light mist hovered over the open fields surrounding the estate. The image team arrived before 7 a.m., bringing equipment, wardrobe options, and a folder detailing the visual script for the session. The concept was straightforward: capture the official portrait of the couple for the upcoming corporate publication. But the execution required precision. Avery was led to the dressing room, where a stylist awaited with 3 outfit choices. They settled on a beige turtleneck blouse, an olive-tone blazer, and a structured knee-length skirt. The ensemble was completed with boots and her hair left down, though neatly styled, projecting a look that was professional, approachable, and composed. Connor appeared minutes later, already dressed in a charcoal jacket, a light-colored shirt, and a light scarf. He handed her a sheet outlining the key poses. The first pose required them to stand with hands intertwined, bodies slightly angled toward each other. It wasn't an intimate gesture, but a visual strategy. Connor extended his hand with precision. Avery took it. The photographer directed the positioning of their faces, the tilt of their torsos, the firmness of their grip. For nearly 40 minutes, they shifted positions under the team's guidance, without commentary. Connor adjusted the pressure of his fingers as needed. At one point, he even suggested a more natural closeness. The final image was intended for the quarterly bulletin cover. Seated side by side on a wooden bench, Avery was to rest her head lightly on Connor's shoulder. The accompanying caption had already been decided. Stability is built through partnership. Upon hearing the instruction, he took a deep breath and nodded. Avery approached slowly, as if testing the waters of a new space. She leaned her head against him. 2 minutes passed. He remained still. When the session concluded, they walked together toward the side entrance. Along the way, Connor said, "My mother was the only one who could touch me without triggering collapse. After she died, I didn't let anyone else try. Until now." The statement was delivered as a casual observation, but it was anything but neutral. She didn't respond. She simply matched his pace, walking beside him. At the door, he remarked, "The photos will be ready in 2 days. You'll see them before publication." Then he went inside. Avery lingered for a few seconds, gazing at the garden where the light was beginning to break through the mist. She realized it was no longer just about photography. It was about the unnamed space between one image and the next. The next morning, Avery arrived at the estate at exactly 8 a.m., as agreed. The entry was discreet, with no questions asked. The guard at the gate simply nodded and allowed her through. Already familiar with the route, she made her way through the corridors to her support room. But before she could settle in, an assistant informed her that Connor wanted to meet her in the Orchid House, a rarely used space located at the far south end of the property. It was unusual for him to request meetings outside the designated areas, and that alone was enough to put her on alert. The Orchid House was a spacious structure, enclosed in glass and maintained at a controlled temperature. Light filtered softly through the tree canopy above, creating a serene atmosphere. The subtle scent of the flowers and the ever-present humidity in the air gave the place an almost untouched feel. Connor was already there, alone, without his blazer, wearing only a rolled-up sleeve shirt. The informality was rare. When he saw her, he simply said, "There's no script today. Let's talk." Mitchell wants to observe spontaneous reactions. That's all. They sat facing each other, separated by a small iron table. Around them, pots of exotic plants filled the room with subtle shapes and colors. They began by talking about the species cultivated there, the importance of humidity balance, of light. The conversation flowed effortlessly. Then the topic shifted. Connor mentioned a book he had been rereading for years. Avery responded with a similar reference. Little by little, the technical language gave way to natural gestures, pauses, soft smiles. It wasn't staged. It was genuine closeness, even if unnamed. At one point, Connor removed his glasses and began cleaning them with a handkerchief he took from his pocket. The motion was slow, almost meditative. As he did it, he spoke as if reflecting aloud. "It's not the cohabitation that bothers me. It's the risk of feeling something I can't predict." Avery listened, in no hurry to respond. It wasn't a provocation. It was an admission. They both understood what it meant to cross the limits outlined in the contract. That afternoon, they were assigned to review the institutional speeches for the upcoming charity event. The meeting took place in the library. They sat side by side. The chairs were closer than usual, and their elbows brushed several times. No one pulled away. No automatic reaction. The reading continued smoothly. At one point, she noted, "Your handwriting changes when you're focused." He looked up and replied, "Your voice changes when you want me to pay attention." The exchange was brief but meaningful. That night, back in her apartment, Avery didn't enter anything into the official reports. She grabbed a loose sheet of paper and wrote a single sentence. "Feeling without collapsing is more dangerous than it seems," and tucked it into a drawer, folded. She knew the experiment was no longer clinical, and yet it went on. Waking up that Thursday felt different for Avery. She could still feel the mild temperature of the Orchid House on her skin, the texture of the shared silence, the brief brush of elbows on the library's wooden table. When she arrived at the mansion, there were no new instructions waiting, just a generic notification on her access tablet. Report to the projection studio at 11 a.m. No details about the purpose of the session, no prior preparation. Whatever was being tested now included the absence of predictability. When she entered the studio, she found Connor already seated, a remote in his hand. Next to him were 2 bottles of water, a notepad, and a large screen waiting for the projection to begin. Without any greeting, he said, "We're going to watch a documentary. 50 minutes. Evaluation afterward. Distance, 12 inches. Arm contact allowed. No talking during the screening." She sat beside him, aligning herself as instructed. Their arms brushed lightly. There was no stiffness. For the first few minutes, Avery focused on the narrative, a study on social behavior in urban settings. But gradually, she noticed her attention beginning to split. She felt the warmth of Connor's arm, the closeness of his shoulder, the steadiness of his breathing. Not a single word was spoken. When the session ended, Connor simply stated, "Complete stability." Heart rate monitored. No elevation. He paused, then added, "The next phase will involve external activity. Be ready to go out with me tomorrow." Later that same afternoon, they were assigned a joint administrative task, reviewing data for a public image campaign. They worked side by side for over an hour. This time, Connor made a spontaneous comment on one of the graphic drafts. Avery offered a suggestion. He considered it and agreed. For the first time, they collaborated as co-workers, not as subject and variable. At the end of the day, as night fell, Connor walked her to the side entrance of the mansion. They paused for a moment under the glass awning. He said, "Some days I forget this is an experiment." She replied, "And some days, remembering is what helps me stay in control." He nodded, said nothing more. But when he opened the door for her, his fingers brushed against hers. And this time, neither of them pulled away. The next morning, Avery arrived at the estate carrying a mix of anxiety and uncertainty. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle made the front steps slippery. She stepped inside, passed through the main hall, and was informed that the vocal training session scheduled for that day had been canceled. The official explanation was the absence of the assigned professional, but the next notification on her tablet suggested a different plan. In short, clipped text. Use free time for unmediated interaction. It was an invitation, but also a quiet directive. Connor appeared shortly after, dressed more casually than usual, a pale cotton shirt, a gray jacket without buttons, and dark jeans he rarely wore. He looked at Avery with a nearly relaxed expression and said, "Let's go out. Nothing official, just a break." Their destination was a cafe in the Jardin de Ceres, located in a private section reserved for members of the cultural club sponsored by the Rosenwald family. The location seemed intentional, off the radar for public appearances, far from the watchful eyes of board members or investors. During the drive, Connor said little. They sat side by side in the back seat of the car, the city blurring past the windows. Avery sensed something was building, but chose not to disrupt the silence. At the cafe, they picked a table in the corner, near the tropical greenhouses. They ordered jasmine tea and a berry tart. The conversation started light, with comments about the weather, other garden visitors, and the menu. But there was something unspoken between them, something quietly accumulating. After they ate, they wandered through the glass and iron corridors of the greenhouse. The dense vegetation created a bubble of humidity and perfume in the air. At one point, they stopped in front of a glass case displaying rare species. Avery pointed at one and made a light comment. That's when she felt Connor's hand rest lightly on her waist, a spontaneous gesture, unprompted. She turned to face him. He didn't pull back. If you wanted to stop, I'll stop now. This isn't part of the protocol, he said, his voice low, almost intimate. Avery looked into his eyes and answered calmly, I don't want you to stop. He stepped closer. His hand touched her face gently, as if checking for warning signs. But there were none, only warmth. The kiss was slow and unhurried. There was no expectation of fireworks, only the quiet confirmation that there was no longer any need for barriers. Their lips met naturally, and the touch was received with surprising ease. When they pulled apart, there were no explanations, no analysis, no clinical feedback. They returned to the car and sat as before, but something had shifted. Their shoulders now rested against each other comfortably. On the way back, Connor stared out the window with a calm expression. At one point, he turned to Avery and said, I'm not reporting this. Not as a failure, not as progress. She simply nodded. No more was needed. When they arrived at the mansion, they climbed the steps to the side entrance together. In the hallway, in front of her room, Connor paused. He looked at her steadily and said, I'll see you at 6, in the reading room. But tonight, no script. She smiled, opened the door, and stepped inside. The soft click of the latch echoed down the hallway. And in that moment, Avery wasn't thinking about reports or protocols. She closed her eyes for a second and knew something inside her had shifted, and it wouldn't be easy to return to where it all began. That's the end of our story. What did you think? Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. See you in the next video.